Jesus died by crucifixion. All right, so starting with multiple attestation. Do multiple historical documents report Jesus dying by crucifixion? Yes, quite a few. Now, I will say, so people, in case you have this misunderstanding, that a lot of people look at your Bible right now, and we talk about the Bible being the best-selling book of all time, right? And we think of it as one book. The Bible is not one book. The Bible is a collection of 66 books that were written over a vast period of time and by numerous different authors. And then we just kind of collected all of these books and put them into one collection that we now call the Bible. So, but when we're looking at this as historians, we look to see each of those books in the Bible as separate works because they were written at different times by different authors. And so just the fact they're published together today is meaningless. It means nothing. At the time, they were completely distinct books. So, knowing that, do we have multiple witnesses to the fact that Jesus died? Yes. Obviously, you got 4 right off the bat, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The 4 gospel authors all report Jesus' death by crucifixion. Also, in the epistles that come after the 4 gospels, what do we have? We have many, many writings of Paul that talk about the fact that Jesus died by crucifixion. We have Peter writing about the fact that Jesus died by crucifixion. We have the author of Hebrews who writes about the fact that Jesus died by crucifixion. All right, so you've got 7 different authors right there alone. 6 if you think Hebrews was written by Paul. There's a whole Bible study on Hebrews on the Trinity Job YouTube channel. You want to look it up. I don't think Hebrews was written by Paul, but in that Bible study, I do kind of give you the arguments on both sides. Either way, you've got 6 or 7 different authors right there alone, all of which are reporting that Jesus died by crucifixion. Now, some skeptics will, and I will say illegitimately, claim that they will not accept any evidence written by Christian authors. And so they will automatically discount all of those 7 authors, saying, yeah, but they were Christians, so they were biased. Well, that's a foolish argument to make, first of all, and I said this in a YouTube short, I think that just went up today. I said, people say, like, well, we're not going to believe these Christian authors because they were Christian. So when they say they saw the risen Christ, they're too biased, so we're not going to believe them. And to that, I asked them, well, what would you be if you saw the risen Christ? It's literally just foolishness. Because if someone was walking around on earth with Jesus for 3 years with his ministry, and they saw him die, and they saw his dead body, and they saw it in the tomb, and then 3 days later, they saw him alive and well, looking like nothing happened to him except still having the holes in his hands and his side and his feet, right? Walking around talking to them, and they didn't become a Christian, then there's something mentally defective going on. I'm sorry. But that's the type of person that doesn't matter what evidence you show them, they're never going to believe. And they're not the type of person who we can trust to provide us with reliable information anyway, right? So obviously, the mere fact that authors were Christians does not, in fact, discount the reliability of their testimony. And it should not discount the reliability of their testimony. And if you do take that approach as a skeptic, then what you're doing is circular reasoning. Because the only reason you are discounting them is because you are assuming at the get-go that they were wrong, that Jesus didn't, in fact, really rise from the dead. Because the whole reason you don't think they're reliable is because, they believe something this foolishness called Christianity. But that's the subject under dispute, right? That's what we're talking about, whether or not these Christian claims are actually true. So you can't assume it at the get-go and use it to disqualify certain evidence. But regardless, it doesn't even matter in this case because the evidence isn't exclusively Christians. We also have Roman historian Tacitus, who was a 1st to 2nd century Roman historian. You have Jewish historian Josephus, who was a 1st century Jewish historian. Both of them also report that Jesus died by crucifixion. Josephus, in his work called Antiquities of the Jews, and this came out around 94 AD, said this about Jesus: Pilate condemned him to death by crucifixion. Now, some skeptics will again balk at this because it is true that there were passages added at a later date by Christians to the Antiquities of the Jews. They got copies of Antiquities of the Jews. They added language to it to make it look like Josephus was admitting Jesus was the Messiah. Josephus did not admit Jesus was the Messiah. You can look at the other surrounding context of the book of the Antiquities to know he did not believe Jesus was the Messiah. And so Christians did add things to it. However, we do have copies of Antiquities that do not have these additions to it. And so historians do generally accept what the original said, all right, before these additions were made to it. And this particular passage that I've got here is one that historians do generally accept. This is authentic. This was in the original that Josephus did say that Pilate condemned Jesus to death by crucifixion. But again, it's also not just Josephus. Tacitus, Roman historian, in his book Annals, which was written about 116 AD, says this: Christus, from whom the name had its origin, the name meaning Christianity, suffered the extreme penalty. What was the extreme penalty under Roman law? Crucifixion, all right. Suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So we have both Christian sources and non-Christian sources all reporting the truth of the crucifixion. All right, so we do have multiple attestation that Jesus did in fact die by crucifixion. Do we have early attestation? Yes. All right, and I'm going to focus on this right now because this is easily the earliest attestation we have. Matter of fact, this is the earliest attestation of anything in the entire New Testament. What is this? This is a passage from the book of 1 Corinthians. Now, this is written by the Apostle Paul, and before people jump up and down, because yes, there are scholars who will dispute some of the authorship of some of the books that are attributed to Paul. They'll say, we don't think Paul really wrote these books. I take issue with that. Maybe we'll get into some of that a little bit later. I think the evidence, especially the external evidence, is overwhelming that Paul did in fact write every book in the Bible that is attributed to him. But regardless, again, it doesn't matter because there's 3 books in the New Testament that scholars pretty much universally agree, yeah, these were in fact written by Paul. And guess what one of them is? 1 Corinthians, all right? So this is not one that scholars dispute. This is in fact the words, these are in fact the words of Paul. All right, and look, here's what 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8 says. At the very beginning, it says, "For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance." All right, so this right there, stop right there for a second. This tells us what Paul is about to relay is something that was relayed to him. And what we see in what comes up next is what historians say is an early Christian creed. Picture it this way. If I were just talking to you in my normal tone of voice, and then all of a sudden I slipped into the Apostles' Creed, or the Nicene Creed, or the Athanasian Creed, you'd be able to detect a shift in my language and my tone, right? And you would be able to say something just shifted here. Ken doesn't sound like he's just conversational Ken anymore. Why? Because there's a certain formality, there's a certain rhythm, there's a certain beat, whatever you could say, a certain tone to creeds. That's what happens here. Now, we lose some of this in English, but remember, this wasn't originally written in English, it was written in Greek. And if you're reading this in Greek, you can tell that there is a shift in tone at this point in time, which does in fact make this sound like a creed, an early creed. So what Paul is doing here is he's reminding the Corinthian church about a creed. What is a creed? A creed is a summary statement of belief. So this is one of the earliest statements that Christians would share to kind of unify themselves, say, hey, this is what we have in common. These are the beliefs that we hold dear. All right, and he was reminding them of this. But the key factor for us is that opening phrase, "for what I received." Well, when did he receive this? Well, fortunately, we can figure that out because in the book of Acts, which is written by the historian Luke, right? Luke reports a number of events about Corinth that we can actually date, that we know the dates of. Let me get my glasses on here because these things are written in small text. Here we go. All right. If I get my bookmark to flip here. Here we go. So one of the events that... John, rest of my notes. Come on, Ken. All right, one of the events that Luke reports is the date when Emperor Claudius kicked the Jews out of Rome. All right, he talks about that. And what happened when that happened, Priscilla and Aquila left Rome and went to Corinth. So that tells us when Priscilla and Aquila got there. Well, by the time 1 Corinthians, Priscilla and Aquila are there. All right, so we know by the time Paul got to Corinth, Priscilla and Aquila were already in Corinth. So when did that happen? That happened in 49 AD. So right there, we know that Paul must have arrived in Corinth after 49 AD. But Luke gives us more. All right, Luke goes on to also talk about when Gallio was appointed governor in the province of Achaia. And he talks about that. And that happened in AD 51. And what we find out in Luke is that Gallio was the governor while Paul was in Corinth. All right, so by AD, so he got there after AD 49, and he had to get there before AD 51. So that tells us Paul got to Corinth sometime around AD 50. All right, and he was there for a couple of years, AD 50 to AD 52, and then he moved on. All right, so if Paul is reminding them of something he taught them when he was there, that means that it must be something that he received prior to AD 50. All right, so when was Paul in a position to have received some teaching prior to AD 50? Well, we also see that about 5-ish years or so after the crucifixion, Paul went to Jerusalem, right? Now, and he went to Jerusalem because he'd seen Jesus on the road to Damascus, right? And so he goes to Jerusalem to learn from Peter and the other apostles. And of course, they don't exactly welcome him with open arms at first because he's been going around persecuting Christians. He's been getting them locked up. He's been getting them killed. He was there at the stoning of Stephen. And so when word gets out that there's this guy Paul who wants to talk to Peter and the others, I mean, the initial reaction is obviously skepticism. But they do eventually talk to him, and they do eventually teach him and tell him what they witnessed, and they tell him about the gospel message, and that's where he starts to get a lot of his firsthand knowledge, and that is where he would have heard this creed. That is where this creed would have been given to him. Well, what that means is Paul is passing on here something that he learned in about 38 AD, about 5 years after the crucifixion, because that's when he was in Jerusalem. That is astoundingly early. And if we look at what is in this creed, we understand this creed is now therefore reciting what Christians believed very early on, at least no later than 5 years after the crucifixion, by like AD 38. Look what he says. He says, "For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas," that's Peter, all right, and then to the 12. That's a colloquialism for the entire group of apostles. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. So right there off the bat, we have in this creed being reported that Jesus did in fact die, all right, and then rose again in accordance to the Scriptures. So that gives us very, very early attestation to Jesus' death, within 5 years or so after the crucifixion. So we have multiple attestation, and we have early attestation. All right. Now let's look at that third criteria, the criteria of embarrassment. All right. The criteria of embarrassment, remember, is when someone admits to something that makes them less likely to be believed or just makes them look bad. All right. Remember, Jesus, the allegation here isn't just that Jesus died. It's that he died how? He died by crucifixion. Take a look at this passage from Deuteronomy, Old Testament law. This is what the Jewish law was at the time when they were trying to convince initially Jews that Jesus was their Messiah. Deuteronomy 21, verses 22 and 23 said, "And if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night upon the tree, but you shall bury him the same day. For a hanged man is accursed by God. You shall not defile the land which the Lord your God gives you for an inheritance. Anybody know how crucifixions were sometimes carried out? I mean, yeah, if you're in Jerusalem and you've got the wood, you'd actually build the wooden cross and you'd put him up there on Golgotha and you'd crucify him on the cross. But were crosses always available? No. So you know what they would do? They crucify people on trees. If there's a tree around, you could nail someone to the tree. Accomplish the same thing. And so crucifixion, even on a cross, came to be known as being hanged on a tree. And so, according to Jewish belief at the time, anyone who was hanged on a tree was under God's curse. Would you, if you wanted people to believe that Jesus was the Messiah, make up a story, not just about him dying, but about him dying in a way that shows he was cursed by God? Now, of course, we all, looking in retrospect, know why he was hanged in a way, he was killed in a way that showed he was under God's curse, because he was taking our sin upon him, right? And so our sin was condemning of him, and that's why it happened in that way. But at the time, they're trying to go out and talk to Jews and say, hey, this guy who you just saw executed in a way that Deuteronomy says he was under God's curse, oh, he was actually God's anointed one. They're going to get laughed at. And maybe that explains why they didn't have as much success at the time amongst Jewish congregations, and eventually the message went primarily out to Gentiles. Yeah, obviously. So under the criteria of embarrassment, we do see that this idea that Jesus died by crucifixion is most likely to be true.